fire. What starts as a heated debate on racial justice explodes when Owens shockingly praises nationalism and defends Hitler, sending shockwaves through America. With millions watching in disbelief, Crockett unleashes a ruthless takedown, exposing Owens's dangerous agenda, sparking a firestorm of backlash. The stakes couldn't be higher. Will the truth destroy Owens, or will her radical rhetoric continue to poison the country? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The lights in the auditorium dimmed as the camera panned across a hushed room, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. Jasmine Crockett stood at one podium, Candace Owens at the other, each woman a symbol of the ideological divide that had come to define America's political landscape. The debate, broadcast live to millions, was set to be a showdown between two powerful voices. The topic was clear: the future of racial justice and the treatment of minorities in the United States. This wasn't just another political discussion. It was a clash of visions for the future, with the nation watching closely. Crockett, a rising star in the Democratic Party, had made it her mission to expose and dismantle the systems of inequality that plagued American society. Owens, the unapologetic conservative commentator, was firmly grounded in the belief that America's problems weren't about race, but personal responsibility and choice. The stage was set, and as the audience waited for the first words to be spoken, it was clear that what would follow wasn't just a debate, it was a battle for the soul of the nation. The room was thick with anticipation as Owens's words settled into the air, the tension so palpable it was almost suffocating. Her declaration, "Black Lives Matter," was nothing more than a scheme for financial gain, a movement built on division, hung like a heavy cloud over the room. She spoke with such certainty, her voice cold, almost clinical, as if dismissing the pain of millions was as easy as spouting off an opinion. The crowd, taken aback, murmured quietly, but no one dared speak up yet. Owens had just made a claim that would force Crockett to respond. The next few moments would determine the direction of this debate. Candace Owens, with a calculated gaze, continued, "Let's be clear, Black Lives Matter isn't a movement for justice. It's a way to profit off of division, off of the fear they've created. This isn't about uplifting Black Americans. This is about making money by exploiting racial injustice." Her words echoed in the space, her voice a mix of anger and arrogance. "I said it at Turning Point USA," she continued, her eyes narrowing. "This movement is nothing more than people using the very real issue of racial inequality to line their pockets and keep the nation in turmoil." The room seemed to hold its breath, the tension thickening. Owens had just issued a direct challenge not only to the movement itself, but to every person who believed in its cause. The accusation was sharp, biting, and in that moment, it felt like a personal affront to every Black American who had ever marched for their rights, for their lives to matter. Jasmine Crockett's fists tightened, her face hardened with a fire that had been building ever since Owens first opened her mouth. The audacity, the complete dismissal of the lived reality of so many, stung like salt in an open wound. This was no longer a debate, it was a call for action. Crockett knew that in this moment, her words needed to carry the weight of history, the truth, and the fight for justice that was far from over. She stepped forward, her voice rising, not in anger, but in unshakable resolve. "Candace, let me be very clear. What you just said is not just irresponsible, it's dangerous. You're telling millions of Americans that their pain, their struggle, the lives lost in the streets, that all of it is just a scheme to make money. You've just spit in the face of every Black person who has been denied justice. You've dismissed their fight for equality as nothing more than a business venture." She paused, letting the words sink in. "And let's not forget, you've said it yourself in front of thousands at Turning Point USA. You've labeled Black Lives Matter as exploitation. But let me tell you, Candace, it's not Black Lives Matter that is exploiting anything. It's people like you who profit off spreading division, who twist the truth to suit your narrative, and who refuse to see the real problem, a system that is rigged against people of color." The words fell heavy on the audience, their weight undeniable. The tension in the room had shifted as Crockett had taken Owens' accusations and turned them back with the force of truth. You can sit there and accuse people of exploiting injustice, she continued, her voice steady, each word landing with precision. But the real exploitation, Candace, is the way you've used your platform to deny the very real, ongoing fight for justice. You don't know what it's like to walk in our shoes, to face the system that was built to keep us down. You've never had to fight for the right to exist in a world that views you as less than. The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. The balance had shifted. Jasmine Crockett had stepped into the ring and not only matched Owens, but had also exposed the dangerous rhetoric she was pushing. It wasn't just about politics. It was about the very lives that were being disregarded in the name of profit, power, and control. And in that moment, it was clear who was fighting for justice and who was trying to tear it all down. The tension in the room was almost unbearable as Candace Owens pressed on, her words slicing through the air with the precision of a scalpel. Let's talk about the real issues, she began, her voice steady, yet cold, as though she had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. The crime rates, the violence, the poverty. These are the things Black Americans need to be focusing on, not some fabricated notion of systemic oppression. Owens's eyes swept across the room, challenging anyone to disagree, to interrupt. She knew she had the audience on the edge, waiting for the next punch. You claim Black Lives Matter's about justice, but in reality, it's about creating division, not healing. It's a movement that thrives off anger, off chaos, and off people who are desperate for change but are being lied to about what's really holding them back. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle, as if daring anyone to challenge her logic. The statistics don't lie, she continued. The crime rates in Black neighborhoods are higher than anywhere else. The poverty rates are astronomical. Black Americans are not being held back by some unseen hand. It's the result of their own choices, their own communities that have failed them. Owen's voice grew more forceful, leaning into the microphone, each syllable cutting through the heavy silence. Black Lives Matter doesn't address that. They don't talk about the root causes of poverty. They don't talk about the rampant crime in these communities or how it perpetuates the cycle of despair. They just point the finger at the system and say, it's all the system's fault, but they're not helping anyone by doing that. They're making it worse. Her words reverberated throughout the room, sinking in like a weight that settled deep in the chest. For a moment, it seemed as if the audience was hanging on her every word, some nodding in agreement, others stunned into silence. It was a sharp contrast to Jasmine Crockett, whose expression was a mixture of disbelief and quiet fury. She had heard this rhetoric before, the blame placed squarely on the shoulders of the community, the denial of the systemic issues that continued to perpetuate inequality. But hearing it here, in this moment, from Owens, who had built her platform on discrediting movements like Black Lives Matter, made her blood boil. She took a slow, deliberate breath, steadying herself, and then stepped forward, the anger in her chest transforming into something far more powerful. Resolve. Candace, Crockett began, her voice calm but firm. You stand here, throwing out numbers and statistics like they explain the reality of Black America. But they don't. They don't come close to touching the heart of the issue. Crime rates, yes, they're higher in certain communities, but you fail to ask why that is. You ignore the why behind the poverty, behind the crime, behind the struggles people face every day. You say it's because of bad choices, but what about the choices people have not been given? What about the generations of families who have had doors closed to them? What about the communities that have been systematically stripped of opportunity? The audience shifted in their seats, leaning in, drawn into the intensity of her words. Crockett's voice didn't waver as she pressed on, each word more forceful than the last. You can't just throw out numbers and pretend they explain away centuries of injustice. You talk about crime and poverty like they're isolated issues, but they're not. They are the direct result of a system that was designed to keep people of color in a perpetual state of disadvantage. And to sit here and pretend that Black Lives Matter doesn't address that it doesn't call out the very system that has kept people in chains for hundreds of years, is not only dishonest, it's dangerous. Crockett's eyes never left Owens as she continued, her voice rising with every word. You want to talk about crime? What about the crimes committed by the system itself? The way black families are ripped apart by mass incarceration? The way entire communities are policed like war zones while white communities are left untouched? You talk about poverty like it's a choice, but you ignore the fact that the same system you defend has denied Black Americans the ability to build wealth, to access quality education, to own property. You ignore the fact that redlining, voter suppression, and unequal schooling are still very much alive today. The weight of her words hit hard, each one an undeniable truth that Owens couldn't escape. You want to talk about Black Lives Matter? They're not the problem. The problem is that people like you refuse to see the problem. You refuse to see the lives lost, the families destroyed, the communities left behind. You refuse to see the history of systemic racism that still shapes every part of our society. Crockett's voice softened slightly, but the conviction in it was unmistakable. Until you understand that, until you see the truth of what's happening in this country, you will never be part of the solution. You'll always be part of the problem. For a moment, there was only silence. The audience, once divided, now seemed unified in their gaze upon Crockett, their attention fixed on her every word. Owens, once so confident, stood there, her face unreadable. The words had cut through the defenses she had built around her, and for the first time in the debate, there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. The truth had been spoken, and it was clear that Crockett wasn't just defending a movement. She was defending the lives of millions of Americans who had been silenced for far too long. The room fell into an unnatural silence, the weight of Jasmine Crockett's words still hanging heavily in the air. The debate, once fiery and impassioned, had taken a turn. But before anyone could fully digest the force of Crockett's last statement, something shifted. A soft buzz echoed through the room, cutting through the tension, drawing everyone's eyes to the large screen behind the podium. The crowd stilled, unsure of what was about to happen. A video, dated from 2018, was now playing. The clip was brief, but it was enough to shatter the narrative Owens had so carefully constructed. The camera zoomed in on Owens, standing confidently at a Turning Point USA event, her voice ringing out with disturbing clarity. "Nationalism, that's what we need," she said, her tone unflinching. "Hitler was a nationalist, and if we're being honest, his methods were just misunderstood." The words hit like a sledgehammer, reverberating through the room. The audience was frozen, disbelief and shock sweeping across the faces of those watching. It wasn't just an offhand remark. Owens had explicitly linked herself to a man responsible for one of the most horrific genocides in human history. For a moment, the room was entirely still. The weight of what had just been said hung in the air like a suffocating cloud. Owens, whose career had been built on a foundation of fiery conservative rhetoric and sharp rebuttals, stood motionless. Her face, once confident and self-assured, now appeared strained, her features tightening as she realized the gravity of what was unfolding. The very words she had spoken in that moment had become her undoing. Jasmine Crockett watched Owens carefully, sensing the shift in the room. The debate had transcended politics. It was now about history, truth, and accountability. Owens had just exposed the dangerous undercurrent of her beliefs, the ideologies she had long tried to hide behind a facade of patriotic conservatism. The audience, once captivated by Owens' rhetoric, now began to murmur, their faces shifting from admiration to suspicion. What was once a celebrated figure among the conservative base was now being exposed as something far more troubling. The video continued to circulate online, and the internet erupted in a frenzy. Social media platforms exploded with the hashtag #Candace Owens exposed trending globally. The backlash was immediate, swift, and unforgiving. On Twitter, prominent conservative voices began to distance themselves. One user tweeted, "I can't believe I ever stood by her. There's no room for this kind of rhetoric in our movement." Another conservative pundit wrote, "Nationalism doesn't mean embracing a tyrant. She's lost all credibility." Even Owens' usual allies were left scrambling for explanations as the video continued to spread like wildfire, with news outlets picking up the story and dissecting every word. The backlash was not just from the left. It was from conservatives who had once championed her as a voice of reason. Owens had crossed a line that few were willing to follow. The revelation wasn't just a scandal, it was a betrayal of the very principles she had long claimed to uphold. Her words had stripped away the mask she had worn, revealing a troubling truth that couldn't be ignored. Crockett, seizing the moment, didn't hesitate. She stood tall, her eyes locked on Owens, and addressed the room, her voice strong and unwavering. "What you've just seen is the reality of Candace Owens," she said, her words cutting through the thick silence. "This is who she really is. She's been masquerading as a defender of freedom, a voice of reason, but in truth she's an apologist for dangerous ideologies. Ideologies that have led to suffering, pain, and death throughout history." Crockett's gaze never wavered from Owens as she continued, her voice rising with the intensity of someone who had just witnessed a moment of history unraveling. "She sits here and claims to fight for the people, but her words show her true allegiance to a distorted vision of nationalism that seeks to divide rather than unite. She can hide behind the guise of patriotism, but the truth is clear. She's not advocating for freedom. She's advocating for a return to a past filled with hate and violence." The room was still, the weight of Crockett's words settling over the crowd like a heavy blanket. Some people were shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Others were staring at Owens, trying to process the reality of what had just been exposed. Owens, once so confident, now appeared cornered, her composure cracking in the face of the truth that had just been revealed. There was no escaping this moment. No carefully crafted defense could undo the damage. The truth was out, and it was clear that this moment would forever alter the trajectory of the debate, and perhaps Owens' career as well. The fallout had begun, and it was going to be much larger than just this room. It was a reckoning. And for Owens, it was a reckoning that could not be undone. The tension in the room was now unbearable, thick with the weight of the revelations that had been laid bare. Candace Owens, once so confident and poised, now stood at the center of the storm she had created. The video from 2018, where she had openly praised nationalism and made an appalling comparison to Hitler, still echoed in the air like a dark shadow. The crowd was still reeling, uncertain of how to process the words they had just heard. But Jasmine Crockett, whose resolve had been hardened over years of fighting for justice, stood unfazed. She could see the cracks in Owens' carefully constructed narrative. The facade was slipping, and it was only a matter of time before the truth would overwhelm her. Crockett, her voice steady but filled with an intensity that made every word feel like a hammer striking iron, stepped forward. "Candace, you want to play the victim, claim that your words were taken out of context, but the reality is this: you can't hide behind excuses anymore. Those words, your words, are out there for the world to see, and they speak volumes about who you really are. You may try to claim that you've been misunderstood, but that doesn't change the fact that you've just openly aligned yourself with the very ideologies that have caused untold suffering for millions. You've given a voice to hate and extremism, and now you want to brush it off as misunderstanding." Crockett's eyes never left Owens as she continued, each sentence growing in weight, her conviction palpable. "You can deny all you want that you support Hitler or that you believe in any form of nationalism that glorifies his methods. But the truth is, you're trying to rewrite history. You've given a pass to an ideology that's responsible for one of the most horrific genocides in human history. You can try to claim you were misunderstood, but your words are clear, and they've made it clear who you stand with. And it's not the side of justice, equality, or humanity." The room was silent, every person holding their breath as the weight of Crockett's words sank in. Owens, visibly uncomfortable, adjusted her posture, trying to regain control. But the cracks were deep, and there was no easy way to mend them. Crockett, with a steely determination, pressed on. "You talk about division, Candace," Crockett said, her voice now rising with a quiet fury. "But it's people like you who are the real architects of division in this country. You preach about unity, but you're doing nothing but sowing hatred and mistrust. You've used your platform to spread dangerous ideas, to promote an agenda that not only threatens the very fabric of our society, but also endangers the lives of millions. You say you're fighting for America, but the truth is you're dividing us. You've taken something as sacred as the pursuit of justice and used it to fuel your own personal gain, to prop up dangerous ideologies that have no place in our world." Owens's face was now flushed with frustration. She tried to interrupt, to deny the accusations, but Crockett wasn't finished. With each word, she drove home the truth Owens could not escape. This isn't just about what you said in a video, Candace. It's about everything you've stood for, everything you've used your platform to promote. This isn't an isolated incident. You've been spreading lies, exploiting the pain of others to further your own agenda. And the truth is, you've sold out the very people you claim to speak for. You've made a career out of dividing this country, of turning people against each other, of making the powerful feel comfortable in their ignorance, while the rest of us are left to deal with the fallout. The words hung in the air, each one feeling like a final blow. Owens' deflections grew weaker with every passing second, and Crockett knew she had the upper hand. The truth had been exposed, and there was no escaping it. Owens was trapped in her own lies, and now Crockett had exposed her for the world to see. "You can't take back what you said," Crockett continued, her voice now calm but filled with an undeniable strength. "You can't rewrite history. You can't just walk away from the reality of the damage you've done. The words you spoke reflect your true beliefs, no matter how hard you try to distance yourself from them now." The crowd, who had been silently watching the back and forth, began to shift, their reactions ranging from disbelief to nods of agreement. Some of them now understood what had been at stake in this debate. Not just political differences, but the very values that defined what it meant to be an American. And in this moment, Crockett was standing firm in her commitment to those values, unwilling to let Owens' dangerous rhetoric go unchecked. Owens, now visibly shaken, took a step back, her composure slipping. The strength she had projected just moments ago was gone, replaced by a growing sense of panic. The truth was undeniable, and for the first time she had no words to defend herself. It wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about exposing the darkness that had been hiding in plain sight. The room, now charged with the weight of the truth, was waiting for her response. But no response came. The silence that followed was deafening, and it was clear. The battle for truth had already been won. The debate had barely ended, but the ripple effects of Candace Owens' controversial comments began to unfold in real time. Within moments of the confrontation, social media platforms exploded with activity. The world now focused entirely on the video that had surfaced and Owens' words. The revelation about her praising nationalism and defending Hitler, even in passing, was not something that could be ignored. The room had barely cleared before the storm began. News outlets quickly picked up on the story, and soon headlines were blaring. Candace Owens faces backlash. Over nationalism remarks, and Owens under fire for controversial comments about Hitler and nationalism. The shockwaves were felt not just on the left, but within conservative circles as well. What had been a routine political debate had now turned into a public relations nightmare for Owens, as the story quickly went viral. Owens, once celebrated by many for her bold commentary, was now the target of widespread criticism. The public had rallied, and it wasn't just progressives calling out her dangerous rhetoric. Conservative voices, those who had once championed Owens for challenging the left, were now distancing themselves from her. "This is not what we stand for," one conservative influencer tweeted, followed by another. "This is not acceptable. This rhetoric has no place in a true patriot's discourse." The backlash came swiftly and relentlessly. On Twitter, hashtags like Candace Owens exposed and Shame on Owens trended. The video, which had been recorded years ago, was now dissected frame by frame, analyzed by commentators from all sides of the political spectrum. The conservative base that had once rallied behind her was now scrambling to distance itself from Owens' shocking remarks. People were demanding answers, forcing Owens to confront her own words, a confrontation she was unprepared for. As the media storm escalated, Jasmine Crockett's voice rose above the noise. She wasn't just going to sit back and watch Owens try to spin her way out of the mess. No, Crockett took the fight straight to her. She took to social media and the press, ensuring that the world would see Owens for what she truly was. "What you've just witnessed," Crockett wrote in a tweet that went viral within hours, "is a woman who has spent years denying the truth of systemic racism, only to reveal she stands with the very ideologies that have sought to destroy the progress we've fought so hard to make. She is not a champion of freedom, but a voice for division." Crockett didn't let the moment slip by. She wasn't going to allow Owens to hide behind excuses or claims of being misunderstood. With each interview, each tweet, Crockett dismantled Owens' defense. "This isn't just about words spoken in the heat of a moment," Crockett said in a televised interview. "This is about the dangerous ideology Candace Owens is aligning herself with. Nationalism, as she defines it, is a callback to a time when hate was accepted, when division was the norm. It's about rewriting history to justify a future where inequality is not just tolerated, but accepted. It's about making people like her comfortable with their privilege while turning a blind eye to the suffering of others." The media, which had once given Owens a platform to spread her views, now watched as Crockett held her accountable. Owens had been put on the defensive, and Crockett seized the opportunity, pushing forward the narrative that Owens couldn't deny. She had made a dangerous alliance with extremism, and now the public was paying attention. "What we saw today," Crockett continued, "is the result of years of rhetoric that has been allowed to fester unchecked." Owens' comments were not an isolated incident. They're part of a larger narrative she's been spreading. And now the truth is out. The truth is that there are people in this country who would rather cling to outdated ideologies than face the reality of the systemic injustice that exists. And that's not just harmful, it's dangerous. As Owens tried to regain control of the narrative, denying any support for Hitler or nationalism, the damage was already done. The backlash was swift and brutal. Owens found herself cornered, unable to escape the truth of her words. No matter how she tried to spin it, the truth had already set the course for the public's perception of her. Jasmine Crockett's condemnation wasn't just about calling out Owens for a single mistake. It was about calling out the ideology behind it. Crockett made it clear that this was no longer just a political debate. It was a battle for the soul of the nation, a fight between those who wanted to move forward and those who sought to bring back the darkness of the past. Owens had crossed a line, and now the world was watching as the consequences played out. In the end, Owens' attempt to downplay her comments was met with an overwhelming wave of disapproval. It was no longer just a matter of political disagreement. It was a moral issue, and Owens had lost. Crockett had not only exposed the truth, but she had become the voice of accountability, demanding that Owens, and those like her, face the consequences of their actions. The public had spoken, and the message was loud and clear. Extremism had no place in the future of this country. The air in the room was thick with tension, a charged silence hanging over the audience after the fiery exchanges. Candace Owens, who had made her career by challenging the left, now found herself on the defensive. But she wasn't ready to back down. After the video had shattered her carefully constructed narrative, Owens quickly regained her composure, her eyes narrowing as she prepared for a counterattack. With a sharp inhale, she leaned into the microphone, her voice rising with a calculated intensity. "You know, Jasmine, what you're doing here is nothing short of manipulation," Owens declared, her gaze sweeping across the room. "You're taking a real issue, racial inequality, and using it as a crutch to build your political career. You're weaponizing racism, turning it into a tool for personal gain. It's disgusting. You've turned the struggle of Black Americans into a political game, and that's not only irresponsible, it's shameful." Her words were calculated, meant to paint Crockett as the villain, to distract from her own missteps. But it was clear that her accusation was a desperate attempt to shift the focus, to regain control of the narrative that was slipping away from her. The room held its breath. Owens had made her move, but Jasmine Crockett, standing tall and composed, wasn't about to let her words slide. Crockett's eyes remained fixed on Owens, unwavering. She had heard this rhetoric before, the constant refrain of playing the race card, the dismissal of Black struggle as a political strategy. But Crockett knew better. She had seen the damage caused by such rhetoric, had watched as these lies tore at the very fabric of her community, and now she was ready to fight back, to expose the dangerous truth behind Owens' words. "You want to talk about manipulation, Candace?" Crockett's voice was calm, but every word was laced with the weight of truth. "You stand there claiming that I'm using race to build my career, but let me tell you something. You're doing the very same thing. You're using your platform to spread dangerous lies, to manipulate the narrative, and to fuel a division that has no place in this country. You are using your influence to tell people that racism is no longer a problem, that the pain and suffering so many people face every single day is just some kind of fabricated story. Crockett paused, letting her words sink in, allowing the weight of the accusation to settle. The room was dead silent, everyone waiting to hear what would come next. Owens, once so poised and confident, now seemed to recoil slightly. But Crockett wasn't finished. She wasn't about to let Owens off the hook, not when the stakes were so high. "You want to talk about political careers, Candace?" Crockett's voice rose, her intensity now matching the weight of the moment. "You've built yours on denying the very real struggles of Black Americans. You've made a name for yourself by twisting the truth, by perpetuating a narrative that serves only your own interests. You have the power to influence millions, and what are you doing with that power? You're using it to spread extremism, to preach that Black people should just pull themselves up by their bootstraps without acknowledging the systems that have held us down for generations. You're standing there selling a lie, and you're doing it to make a profit. You're not interested in justice, Candace. You're interested in power." The room was electric, the energy shifting from uncertainty to a collective sense of outrage. Crockett's words were cutting deep, and it was clear she wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for every Black American who had ever been told they weren't working hard enough, who had been told that their struggles were imaginary, that their fight for justice was just a political stunt. Owens, visibly rattled, straightened up, her defense becoming more frantic. "That's not what I said. You're twisting everything I've said," she snapped, her voice trembling slightly, no longer as confident as before. "I don't deny racism exists. I've never said that. But I'm telling you, the real problem is personal responsibility, not the system. Black people can succeed, just like anyone else, if they take responsibility for their lives." But Crockett wasn't buying it. She wasn't going to let Owens twist her words and manipulate the conversation any longer. "Personal responsibility?" Crockett scoffed, her eyes flashing with fire. "You don't get to lecture people about personal responsibility when you've never had to fight for every inch of opportunity in a system that was never designed to help you. You don't get to stand there and talk about responsibility when you've never had to worry about being shot by the police for simply existing. You've never had to worry about being denied a job, a house, or even the chance to live in peace because of the color of your skin. And yet, you're standing here telling people that they're the problem." Each word Crockett spoke was a pointed challenge, cutting to the heart of the issue. The room, once divided, was now drawn together in unity, united not by party lines, but by the undeniable truth Crockett was speaking. She wasn't just defending her beliefs, she was defending the very real lived experiences of millions of Americans who had been systematically oppressed. "You stand here, Candace, talking about personal responsibility," Crockett continued, her voice strong. "But the truth is, you're blind to the reality of what Black people face every single day. You're blind to the fact that the system is rigged. You're blind to the fact that your words are hurting people. And worse, you're using your platform to spread this dangerous message to others, to convince them that the system isn't broken, that nothing needs to change. You're the one doing the manipulating here, Candace. You're the one using the truth to push your own agenda." As Crockett finished, the room erupted into applause. The audience, once uncertain, was now fully behind her, sensing the truth that had been laid bare. Owens, on the other hand, was left floundering, unable to respond. Her defenses had crumbled under the weight of Crockett's relentless, unwavering truth. The air was thick with the intensity of the moment. Crockett had won, not just the debate, but the moral high ground. Owens, who had once been so confident, now stood exposed, her words no longer able to shield her from the truth. The fallout from Candace Owens' comments had been swift, brutal, and unforgiving. What had begun as a fiery political debate on a public stage had quickly spiraled into a full-scale scandal, with Owens now standing at the center of a storm she could not control. The video clip, circulating rapidly across social media, became the spark that ignited the backlash, a backlash that soon engulfed her career, reputation, and personal life. The moment her words were exposed for what they were, the reaction was immediate. The media, which had once celebrated her as a rising star, now turned on her with a vengeance. News outlets that had once featured Owens in primetime slots, offering her a platform to promote her views, began to distance themselves. Major media organizations like Fox News, which had frequently given her a voice, issued official statements distancing themselves from her rhetoric. Contracts that once seemed secure and steady were now being pulled. The conservative pundit was no longer the darling of the right. She was the pariah, the person who had crossed a line that even her most loyal followers couldn't overlook. Her social media accounts, once a battleground for heated exchanges and political sparring, became a war zone of hate and betrayal. Twitter exploded with condemnation from both sides of the political spectrum. Her name trended, but not in the way she had anticipated. The hashtags Candace Owens, exposed and shame on Owens, filled up feeds, drowning out her attempts to defend herself. Some of her former allies, people who had once praised her for speaking her truth, were now turning their backs on her, disavowing her remarks in public statements. "Never in my life did I think I would have to disown someone I once supported," one prominent conservative voice tweeted, their disillusionment clear in every word. "This is not the message we stand for." The tweet was followed by a flood of similar condemnations. In a matter of hours, Owens went from being one of the most influential voices on the right to being a figure of public disgrace. The fallout wasn't just from progressives or left-leaning individuals, it was coming from all corners. The backlash was too great, too swift for her to manage. But the most piercing part of this public humiliation came from within her own base. Former supporters of her work, people who had admired her unapologetic stance on issues of race, now found themselves questioning her integrity. The conservative movement that had once elevated her was now abandoning her. She was being painted as a danger to the cause she had championed, a figure who, in her attempt to be provocative, had stepped over a line that no one, regardless of political affiliation, could ignore. Her public defense of extremism, no matter how she tried to reframe it, had alienated her from the very people who had once stood by her. Behind the scenes, the impact was equally severe. Contracts with major conservative media outlets were terminated almost overnight. Her public speaking engagements were canceled in droves. The lucrative endorsements she had once enjoyed evaporated as quickly as the fallout had spread. She had been the face of a certain brand of conservative thought, outspoken, unafraid, and willing to push the boundaries. But now that very boldness had turned into her undoing. The scandal was too much for her to recover from, at least in the short term. For Owens, the collapse was sudden, shattering her career in an instant. Her phone rang incessantly, the messages piling up from former colleagues, agents, and managers, some offering words of sympathy, others simply cutting ties. There were the angry phone calls, the passive-aggressive emails, and the media requests for interviews that she now dreaded. She had become a subject of curiosity, yes, but not for the reasons she had hoped. The question on everyone's lips was no longer about her opinions on politics or race. It was about her ties to nationalism, about her ill-fated comparison to one of history's most notorious figures. The irony was almost unbearable. Candace Owens had built her empire by challenging the status quo, by questioning mainstream narratives, and by positioning herself as the voice of the disenfranchised in the conservative movement. But in the wake of her Hitler comments, she became the embodiment of everything she had spent her career fighting against. The public's perception of her had shifted from being a fierce fighter for conservative values to a symbol of extremism and intolerance. The very platform that had helped her rise to prominence had now turned its back on her, and the media, the very thing that had catapulted her into the spotlight, had now become the source of her downfall. The irony wasn't lost on Crockett. She had seen this kind of thing before, seen how dangerous ideas could be cloaked in words that sounded so convincing at first. But this time, she had a front-row seat to the unraveling. Crockett had been relentless in her condemnation of Owens, and she was not about to let the public forget the damage Owens had done. Every interview, every tweet, every speech was an opportunity for Crockett to double down, to make it clear that the dangerous ideologies Owens had flirted with were not just dangerous to the Black community, but to the country as a whole. Candace Owens has spent her entire career minimizing the very real, very painful struggles that Black Americans face, Crockett said in a televised interview. her tone calm but full of conviction. She's used her platform to spread lies, to fuel hate, and to dismiss the systemic racism that continues to destroy lives. What she said about Hitler, about nationalism, was not a slip of the tongue. It was an endorsement of everything we have been fighting against for generations. She's using her platform to perpetuate division, and that is something we cannot allow. Crockett's words echoed through news outlets, and the impact was undeniable. The backlash Owens faced wasn't just personal, it was a moral reckoning. It wasn't just about defending her career or salvaging her public image. The debate had shifted into something more significant, a battle over the future of the nation's discourse, one that Crockett had every intention of winning. And while Owens tried desperately to regain control of the narrative, issuing statements claiming the video was taken out of context, Crockett remained resolute. "You can spin this all you want, but the truth is clear," Crockett continued, her voice unwavering. "You've shown us who you really are, Candace. And it's time for the country to take a long, hard look at the damage you've done. You are not a champion for freedom. You're an architect of division, and that's a legacy I will not let stand." As the public reaction intensified, Owens's attempts to spin her words began to fall apart. The media had turned on her, and there was no escape from the storm she had created. She was now forced to face the consequences of her words. Words that had once seemed harmless, but that now carried a much heavier weight. The country had spoken, and the backlash was deafening. Her fall from grace had come quickly, but the damage she had caused would take much longer to repair, if it could be repaired at all. The storm had passed, but its aftermath left a trail of destruction in its wake. The media frenzy surrounding Candace Owens' comments and the fallout from her scandal had completely reshaped the narrative of the debate. Owens, once a leading figure in conservative circles, was now scrambling to regain control of the narrative. But for Jasmine Crockett, this was not just another moment in her political journey. It was a defining one. As the dust settled and the world watched, Crockett found herself not just defending her views, but solidifying her place as one of the most powerful voices in the Democratic Party. Crockett's career had always been defined by her unwavering commitment to justice. She had spent years battling in the trenches, fighting for the rights of those whose voices had long been ignored. But the debate with Owens marked a turning point. The intensity of the moment had thrust her into the national spotlight, and now the world was paying attention. She had not only confronted Owens head-on, but had dismantled her arguments with precision, revealing the dangerous rhetoric Owens had been spreading. The victory was monumental, not just for Crockett, but for the larger movement of racial justice that she had championed. The moment of triumph, however, was not without its cost. As Owens' world crumbled, Crockett's own journey had just begun to gain momentum. The debate, which had started as a simple political discourse, had evolved into a battle for the soul of America. Crockett had become the face of the struggle for justice, and the implications of this shift were felt across the country. Her voice, once a passionate but relatively quiet presence in political circles, had now become a rallying cry for those who sought a better future, a future where inequality and systemic racism were no longer tolerated. The impact of the debate was undeniable. It highlighted the stark contrast between two fundamentally opposing worldviews, one rooted in justice and equality, the other in division and denial. For many, Crockett's response to Owens was the crystallization of everything that was at stake in the ongoing battle for racial equity in America. It was a moment where Crockett's values were not just defended, they were elevated to the national stage, challenging the very foundations of what many thought they knew about the future of the country. Crockett was not just another politician rising through the ranks. She was a force of nature, a leader who had proven herself on the front lines. The spotlight that had once illuminated Owens now shone squarely on Crockett. But the attention came with its own set of challenges. The political establishment, both in her own party and across the aisle, had to reckon with the power she wielded. They had seen her fight with fire, not just in words but in actions, and they knew that the future of the party would depend on whether they embraced her leadership or tried to silence her. Yet Crockett was undeterred. The challenges, the obstacles, the attacks, none of it mattered. She had always known that her path would not be an easy one. As a Black woman in politics, she had faced the kind of systemic opposition that few could truly comprehend. She had watched as the powers that be tried to label her as an angry radical, as someone too willing to speak the truth that they were all too afraid to face. But she had turned every attack, every criticism, into fuel for her mission. Now, more than ever, she was ready to confront the injustices that had defined her entire life and career. The debate had done something to Crockett. It had awakened something deeper, something more powerful. The backlash that Owens had received wasn't just a victory for Crockett. It was a vindication of everything she had fought for. Every marginalized voice, every oppressed community had been given a platform in that moment, and Crockett had been their champion. The fight was far from over, but the momentum was now on her side. The debate also shed light on the deepening polarization in American politics. On one side, Crockett's vision of racial justice and equality stood in direct opposition to Owens's call for a return to a dangerous nationalism that dismissed the very real struggles of marginalized communities. The divide was clear. Crockett represented the future of a country that sought to heal its wounds and build a more just society, while Owens embodied the forces that were determined to keep those wounds open, to perpetuate the lie that inequality was a thing of the past. As the media continued to cover the aftermath, Crockett's influence only grew. She was invited to speak at rallies, interviews, and forums across the country, her message resonating with a broader audience than ever before. The Democratic Party, which had often struggled to unite its base, now had a powerful and clear voice leading the charge. Crockett's message was not just about politics. It was about the future of America, about a vision where every person, regardless of their race, background, or circumstance, had an equal shot at success. The narrative surrounding Crockett began to shift, and she found herself at the heart of a new movement, one that wasn't just about opposing the right, but about forging a path forward. She had proven that she was willing to challenge the status quo, to confront the deep-seated injustices that had plagued the country for generations. Now, her leadership was being recognized not just by her supporters, but by those who had once dismissed her as a mere figurehead. Crockett was no longer just another voice in the crowd. She was a force to be reckoned with. But Crockett knew this victory was only the beginning. She had opened a door, but the fight was far from over. The forces she had exposed, the ones that sought to keep America divided, to deny the existence of systemic racism and inequality, would not go down without a fight. And while the momentum was on her side now, she understood that the real work was still to come. It was a work that would require more than just speeches and headlines. It would require the kind of leadership that could unite the country, heal its wounds, and finally dismantle the systems of injustice that had held so many back for so long. For now, though, Jasmine Crockett had proven that she was ready for whatever came next. Her moment had arrived, and the world was watching. This was no longer just about one debate, one victory. This was about the future of America, and Crockett was determined to ensure that the future would be one where justice and equality were not just ideals, but reality. The stakes were higher than ever, and Crockett was not about to let them slip away. The room was still buzzing with the aftermath of the fierce debate, the air thick with the tension that had escalated to an unimaginable height. Jasmine Crockett stood tall, her posture unshaken, even as the weight of the entire nation seemed to bear down on her. She had just delivered the defining blow, the moment that would forever change the trajectory of this conversation. One that had started with political rhetoric, but had spiraled into something much larger, more profound. Candace Owens, once brimming with confidence, was now a broken figure, her facade cracking under the pressure of the truth. But despite her victory in this battle, Crockett knew that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a larger war, one for the soul of America. The echoes of Owens's words still lingered in the room, and Crockett knew that they would continue to reverberate across the country. Owens's attempt to erase the pain of systemic racism, to dismiss the struggle for justice as a mere political ploy, had failed. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no going back. But even as Owens reeled from the impact of her own words, Crockett understood the dangerous forces that were still at play. The battle for justice was not won with one debate, one clash. It would take every ounce of strength, every day of perseverance, to push back against the forces of division and hate that were so deeply entrenched in American society. Crockett took a deep breath, her mind racing as the weight of the moment sank in. She had just taken on one of the most influential voices of the far right, and for the first time, it felt as if the tide was beginning to turn. The energy in the room had shifted. What had once been a one-sided confrontation was now a moment of reckoning, not just for Owens, but for the millions of Americans who were watching, who were listening, and who had been waiting for a leader like Crockett to finally speak out. It wasn't just about politics. It was about the truth of what had been happening to Black Americans for generations, and the fight to ensure that truth could no longer be ignored. But Crockett knew better than to believe that the fight was over. The forces she was up against were powerful, and they had been entrenched for far too long. Owens might have been temporarily silenced, but her ideology, the dangerous narrative that fueled division and denied the existence of systemic oppression, was far from gone. It would take more than just words to dismantle the structures that had kept so many in chains for centuries. It would take action. It would take unity. It would take courage in the face of overwhelming opposition. And Crockett was ready for it. With a calm but resolute voice, Crockett addressed the room once again, her words carrying the weight of everything she had fought for. "This is not just about me, and it's not just about Candace Owens," she began, her eyes sweeping across the room, making eye contact with each person whose life had been touched by the systemic forces she had spent years exposing. "This is about every single person who has ever been told their life doesn't matter. This is about every Black American who has had to fight, not just for their place in society, but for their right to exist with dignity, with equality. And this right here is about ensuring that no one, no matter how powerful, no matter how loud, can ever erase that truth again." Her voice grew stronger, the conviction in her words undeniable. The forces that try to keep us divided, the ones that tell us to accept injustice as the way things are the same forces that have been trying to silence us for generations. They will do anything to keep us from recognizing the power we hold when we stand together, when we speak the truth, when we fight for what is right. But I'm here to tell you, this is our moment. This is the moment where we make it clear that justice will not be pushed aside, that the truth will not be buried under lies. We have the power, and we will not stop until justice is no longer a dream, but a reality for every person, in every community, in every corner of this nation. The room erupted into applause, but Crockett's focus never wavered. She knew that applause was just a small sign of support, a fleeting moment in time. The real work would begin now. This moment, this victory over Owens's rhetoric, had merely served as a signal that the fight was real, that it was ongoing, and that it would take everything to dismantle the systems of power that had long gone unchecked. It would take more than just one debate to change a nation. It would take a movement. Jasmine Crockett had no illusions about the road ahead. The truth, though powerful, was not enough to break the chains of injustice. She had seen firsthand the way the system worked, how it fought back, how it adapted, how it crushed anyone who dared to challenge it. But she had also seen what happened when people fought back. She had seen what happened when the truth became too loud to ignore. She had seen the spark of change, and now she was ready to fan it into a fire that would burn brighter than anything the powers of division could muster. The moment Crockett had just experienced, standing tall, facing down one of the loudest voices of the far right and emerging victorious, was a testament to the power of truth, the power of resilience, and the power of justice. But it was also a reminder of the fight that lay ahead. The battle for racial equality, for justice, for truth, was not something that could be won in a single debate or a single victory. It was a lifelong struggle, one that would demand every ounce of courage and strength from those willing to stand up and fight for what was right. And as Crockett walked off the stage, the weight of the moment settled on her shoulders. She had won today, but the real fight was just beginning. With every step she took, she was more determined than ever to ensure that the truth would continue to be heard, no matter how loud the opposition became. The world had seen what happened when one person stood up for justice, and now it was time to see what would happen when millions did the same. For Jasmine Crockett, this wasn't just a personal victory. It was the first step in a movement that would change the course of history. The forces of extremism, the forces of division, had been exposed. And now it was time for the forces of truth and justice to rise up and claim their place in the future of America. As Jasmine Crockett stood there, the dust of the battle settling around her, a quiet realization washed over her. The fight wasn't just about winning a debate, silencing a controversial voice, or proving her point. No, this was about something far more profound. This moment had stripped bare the truth that so many had spent lifetimes trying to ignore. It wasn't just about a political argument. It was about the very essence of justice, equality, and what it means to stand up in the face of overwhelming adversity. She had fought not just for herself, but for everyone whose voice had been drowned out by those who refused to see their humanity. Her words had cut through the lies, the twisted rhetoric, and the dangerous ideologies that had long held power. But the cost of this fight had been steep. The weight of every insult, every attack, every attempt to dismiss her had been borne on her shoulders alone. She had been called angry, radical, and divisive. She had been told to sit down, to be quiet, to accept the injustice around her. But instead, she had chosen to stand up and speak the truth, no matter the consequences. In that moment, Crockett understood something essential. The greatest battles aren't won with fists or sharp words alone. They're won with the courage to stand up when it would be easier to remain silent. They're won by those willing to confront the forces that seek to keep others in the shadows, to expose the truth even when it's uncomfortable, even when it threatens to upend everything. The truth was the weapon that would tear down the walls built to divide and silence. And Jasmine Crockett had chosen to wield it, with every ounce of strength and determination she had. But the journey wasn't over. It never was. For every victory won, another battle would rise in its place. The forces of division, the voices of hate, the systems that perpetuate inequality, they wouldn't disappear overnight. They were deeply entrenched, woven into the fabric of society, and they wouldn't go quietly into the night. And that was the painful reality Crockett had to face. The momentary triumph over Owens, though satisfying, was only the beginning of a much larger, more challenging war. What Crockett had come to realize was that real change doesn't come from defeating an enemy in one battle. It comes from an unyielding commitment to keep fighting, keep pushing forward, and keep telling the truth, no matter how difficult or dangerous it may be. It comes from knowing that the path to justice is not linear. It is full of setbacks, frustrations, and moments of doubt. But it is also filled with moments of clarity, moments of triumph, and moments where the truth shines so brightly that nothing can hide it. As Crockett stood there, the weight of the moment not yet fully settling in, she knew that her journey was far from over. There were more people to fight for, more systems to tear down, and more lies to expose. But there was also a deeper understanding of the stakes. This was more than just a political fight. It was a fight for the soul of the nation, for the very heart of what it meant to be free, to be equal, and to be human. For Jasmine Crockett, the lesson was clear. When you fight for justice, you do so not for the applause or the recognition, but because the fight itself is the only way forward. The world may try to silence you, the world may try to turn its back on the truth, but the truth will always find its way to the surface. And when it does, nothing will ever be the same again. The battle may never be easy, but the victory of truth, in the end, is worth every sacrifice. And so, the journey continued, because as long as there was injustice, there would always be a need for warriors like Jasmine Crockett, ready to fight, ready to stand tall, and ready to speak the truth, no matter the cost. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. Jasmine Crockett walked into Congress to expose tax injustice. Nick Sorter showed up with a doctored video, a media empire behind him, and one goal: destroy her credibility on live TV. For 10 minutes, they clashed over truth, power, and race. until a single document turned everything upside down. When Jasmine unveiled a secret swatting scandal and a photo linking Sortor to billionaire manipulators, the hearing exploded into a national reckoning. One woman, one folder, and the silence that brought down an empire. So when the nation held its breath, what exactly did Jasmine Crockett say? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The chamber doors closed with a deep metallic thud as the emergency session was called to order. The hearing was unprecedented, Congress convening not to debate legislation, but to put the ethics of the media itself on trial. Headlines had flooded the country for weeks, journalists accused of distorting public perception, shaping tax policy from behind the veil of opinion. Jasmine Crockett sat poised at the front of the committee chamber, invited as a key witness to speak on how manipulated media narratives had warped public understanding of tax justice and fueled resistance to reform. She had seen firsthand how truth had been twisted, how her own words had been clipped and repackaged to serve the powerful. But what the public hadn't expected, and what sent a ripple through the hearing room, was the name at the top of the witness list: Nick Sortor. The controversial conservative firebrand, whose viral headlines had ignited outrage against Crockett's proposals, was now under federal scrutiny. The official reason: multiple articles tied to his name had shown signs of factual distortion, selectively edited quotes, and unverifiable sources. And now he was no longer the man behind the curtain. He was in the hot seat, summoned to account for the chaos he'd helped create. The hearing room had seen its share of tense moments, but nothing like this. The tension didn't build. It arrived all at once, like a sudden drop in pressure before a storm. Jasmine Crockett sat composed, her palms resting flat on the lacquered surface before her, fingers still, eyes locked forward. She had testified before. She had debated, fought, endured. But today was different. Today wasn't about defending a policy. It was about defending truth itself. And across the room, stepping through the double doors with slow, confident steps, was the man who had spent months undermining hers. Nick Sortor entered without urgency, yet with full intention. He didn't scan the room. He surveyed it. His eyes found Jasmine instantly, and when they did, he didn't nod, didn't smile. He just looked, a long, calculating look, as if assessing whether the woman before him was truly the threat his headlines had made her out to be, or something worse, someone he couldn't control. Then, without breaking gaze, he let out a breath. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. Just enough to say, "This is mine." He moved toward the table, pulled out his chair with a flick of his wrist, and sat with the kind of comfort only men used to being unchallenged ever seem to carry. The chairperson began to speak, outlining the procedural limits of the hearing. But barely 20 seconds in, Sortor raised his hand, then spoke without waiting to be recognized. "Chairwoman, if I may," he said, voice calm but edged with condescension. "Let's not kid ourselves about what's happening here. This isn't oversight. This is theater." His eyes shifted, not to the committee but to Jasmine. "We're here today because certain people didn't like what was written about them. And now they're trying to rewrite the script." He gestured broadly, his tone turning almost amused. "In a free country, we don't define transparency by how uncomfortable it makes elected officials feel. And we definitely don't hold hearings just because someone's narrative got challenged in a headline." A few committee members shifted uncomfortably. Jasmine didn't move. Her shoulders remained square, her expression unreadable. But behind her stillness was a practiced resistance, built not from pride but from years of surviving rooms like this. She had heard this tone before, the voice of a man who believed intellect and arrogance were the same thing. She had felt this posture before, the smug certainty that a woman like her would eventually crack. But this time, she wasn't here to react. She was here to expose. And she could already see it. Behind the polished suit and rehearsed swagger, Nick Sortor was bluffing, loud, deflecting. He had shown his hand too early, and Jasmine, silent, unshaken, was already beginning to see exactly where to strike. The silence that followed Sortor's provocation was taut, but it didn't last long. With a calculated flick of his wrist, He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a slim black tablet, placing it flat on the witness table with a performative kind of care. His voice, when he spoke again, was low but theatrical, like someone preparing to deliver a twist in a courtroom drama he had already written. "Since we're speaking about narratives," he said, tapping the screen twice, "I think it's only fair the committee sees this." The chamber lights dimmed slightly as a monitor behind the panel flickered on. Instantly, Jasmine's face appeared on screen. Grainy, recorded in a dimly lit room, her voice clearly audible. She was seated at what looked like a small round-table discussion, her sleeves rolled up, mid-conversation. "We can't keep playing nice with these people," she was saying. "If we want real change in the tax code, we need pressure, not patience." Another voice off-screen laughed, followed by Jasmine's voice again. "Look, if the moderates won't move, we go around them. We go through them." Gasps echoed across the chamber. Sorter leaned back in his chair, folding his arms as if the verdict was already written. "This, members of the committee, is your witness," he said slowly. "A sitting congresswoman casually discussing how to override due process in collaboration with what I'm sure she'll call just community advocates, but whom the rest of us recognize as hard-left political disruptors." He gestured toward the screen, now frozen on a frame of Jasmine mid-sentence, eyes fierce, hand raised. She wasn't talking policy. She was plotting strategy with groups known to organize disruptive protests and media pressure campaigns against elected officials, against this very institution. His voice lowered into a near whisper. "Let that sink in." The panel was still. Jasmine could feel the change, not in words but in air pressure, in posture. One of the Republican committee members scribbled something hastily onto a legal pad, while another leaned in to whisper behind a cupped hand. Even the Democrats seemed suddenly quieter. Their eyes weren't hostile, but they weren't as certain as they had been minutes ago. It was a shift, a familiar, brutal one. She kept her face still, her breathing measured. But inside, something tightened. Not from fear. She had long since outgrown the luxury of that, but from the bitter taste of recognition. This wasn't just political theater. It was tactical. She had spent months working behind the scenes with community groups, financial reform experts, and legal scholars, building alliances that could pressure Congress to close the tax loopholes that let billionaires pay less than their own staff. She knew what she had said, she knew what she had meant, and she knew exactly how that clip had been sliced, reshaped, and deployed like a weapon. Sorter wasn't finished. He rose now, slowly, like a man preparing to deliver a final blow. "You can call it context," he said, pacing slightly as he spoke. "But when someone in elected office sits in a private meeting, unguarded, and talks about going through opposition lawmakers to force tax reform, that's not just passion. That's an admission." He turned to the panel. "She says the media distorts the truth. I say, let's listen to her words. Unfiltered. She says she's defending the people. I ask, since when did the people's voice come with a strategy memo from radical groups with a history of protest arrests?" He stopped walking. "The committee asked if media was being weaponized. I'd argue what we're really seeing is something worse. Elected power, weaponized in silence." Cameras clicked. Aides typed furiously. One senator looked down, shook his head slightly. No one said it out loud, but Jasmine knew. They were wondering, not whether the video was real, but whether it was enough. Enough to taint the credibility of everything she just said. Enough to shift the public perception away from the tax code and back toward a spectacle. Enough to make the truth irrelevant. She sat still, her fingers folded tightly together now beneath the table. She could feel the burn behind her eyes, but she held it. Not here, not now. What enraged her most wasn't the lie itself. It was how expertly it had been crafted to echo centuries of tactics. How quickly even good men would hesitate when a powerful black woman dared to speak unfiltered. They wouldn't call her angry, not in this room, but they would call her dangerous. And they'd say it with questions, with pauses, with procedural delay. The cut would come slow, but it would come all the same. Sorter sat down slowly, with the smugness of someone who believed he had outplayed the system. He crossed his legs, folded his hands, and looked straight ahead. Not at her, He didn't need to. His eyes said it all. He thought he had turned the tide. But Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. Not because she wasn't shaken, but because she had expected this. She had walked into that room knowing what Sorter would try. And now that he had laid his cards on the table, she finally saw his hand for what it was. Not strength, but strategy. Not truth, but timing. A desperate man throwing sparks in the hope of starting a fire. And she would answer. On her terms. When it mattered most. The silence after the video wasn't silence. It was suffocation. Jasmine could feel it pressing in from all sides. The doubt, the weight of insinuation, the 1,000 unspoken judgments clinging to the corners of the room like smoke. She had been here before. Not in this exact chamber, not with cameras pointed at her, but in rooms where her words were stripped for parts and her intentions reduced to threat. And now Nick Sorter, a man who had never known the weight of silence used as a weapon, had delivered his message. Sit down. Be grateful. Stay quiet. She didn't. Jasmine stood slowly, deliberately, the legs of her chair scraping against the floor with a sound that cut the silence clean in two. She didn't ask for the floor. She took it. Her voice when it came wasn't loud, but it carried like steel. Let me be perfectly clear, she said, locking eyes with the committee chair, then with Sorter. That video, what you just saw, was doctored. She held the room's gaze. The audio has been cut, the context removed, and phrases rearranged to imply something I never said, never meant, and would never stand for. The monitor still glowed behind her, frozen on an unflattering frame of her mid-sentence. Mouth half open, hands in motion. She turned to face it. If this committee has any commitment to truth, then I formally request that a forensic authentication be performed on that recording. Immediately, not by Mr. Sorter, not by any media outlet, but by a neutral digital verification body. She pivoted back to the panel. Because I don't answer to edited tapes. I answer to the truth, and I refuse to let a spliced video become a substitute for it. She paused, not to breathe, but to let the words land. There was a new kind of silence now, not suspicion, but listening. Then with her hands steady on the table, she leaned forward slightly, her voice growing firmer, cutting closer. Let's be honest about what's happening here. A man with no lived experience of systemic injustice just played a manipulated video to paint a black woman as a threat to national order. Her eyes burned with precision, not rage, but purpose. Are we really going to sit here and let someone like Nick Sorter, someone who has never once had to navigate policy as survival, decide who gets labeled extreme? She gestured calmly toward him. A man who profits from outrage, who traffics in division, who calls himself a journalist but behaves like an agent provocateur? Her voice lowered, colder now. You want to talk about danger? Let's talk about the danger of giving a platform to a man who believes he can manufacture facts, then weaponize them against the very people fighting for those left behind by this country. She turned to the panel again, eyes sweeping deliberately across each face. This is not about what I said behind closed doors. This is about who gets to shape the truth and who gets punished for telling it aloud. Sorter shifted in his seat now, no longer smirking. His hand twitched toward the mic, but Jasmine didn't give him space to speak. Her tone became quieter, but somehow heavier. There are two kinds of power in this room, she said. The power of proximity and the power of perspective. One comes from sitting close to privilege. The other comes from having to fight every day just to be heard. She pointed gently toward herself. I know which one I carry, and I know which one he fears. For a moment, the entire chamber felt frozen. No rustling papers, no coughs, no side conversations. Just her voice steady in the center of it all. You've been told that I'm dangerous, she said softly, that I'm angry, that I want too much too fast. But I ask you, what's more dangerous? Demanding fairness in taxation or distorting facts to silence those who do? Her gaze swept the room again. Because that's what just happened here. I was silenced, digitally, surgically, and paraded as a warning. Not to you, but to everyone like me who dares to speak with clarity in a room designed to keep us fragmented. And with that, Jasmine stepped back, her breath steady, her hands returning to the table. She didn't look at Sorter again. She didn't need to, because she had just rewritten the frame, not the one frozen on the screen behind her, but the one hanging in the mind of everyone in the room. And the woman in that frame was not the villain. She was the line they weren't supposed to cross. And now they had. The room hadn't settled after her rebuttal. It had shifted. Jasmine could feel it. The tension had evolved from suspicion to discomfort, from discomfort to unease. Sorter was still seated, arms crossed, his eyes narrowed in controlled defiance. But something in his posture had changed. He wasn't smirking anymore. He was waiting, bracing. He thought the worst was over, and Jasmine, standing tall behind her chair, knew exactly what came next. She had defended herself. Now it was time to tell the part of the story no one in that room was prepared to hear. She reached calmly into a thin, red file folder resting on the table. No dramatics, no flourish, just a deliberate gesture. She held up a document, single page, stamped confidential in faded gray across the top. Her voice was low when she spoke, almost soft, but it landed like thunder. Since Mr. Sorter has taken the liberty of presenting evidence to question my integrity, she said, eyes flicking to the committee, I believe it's only fair that we do the same with his. She placed the page flat on the table. What you're looking at is an internal law enforcement report, dated March 8, 2023. It details a false emergency call, what's commonly known as a swatting, made against a sitting city council member in Ohio. The name was there, in black ink, Nick Sorter. There was a long beat of silence. No one moved. Jasmine continued. The report traces the IP origin of the call to an anonymous burner number. But what's more interesting is that the address linked to the burner phone account, used to register the number only days before the call, matched an address owned by a media production firm in Kentucky, she said, her voice growing sharper, a firm whose registered spokesperson, at the time, was none other than Mr. Sorter. The room snapped into motion. One of the senators audibly muttered, Jesus Christ! A gasp rippled through the rows of press. Staffers glanced at each other. Even the chairperson sat up straighter. The sound of fingers tapping rapidly on tablets and phones echoed behind the cameras. And for the first time since he had entered that room, Nick Sorter looked cornered. His mouth opened, then closed. His hands, once so controlled, clenched into fists. Jasmine didn't give him space to recover. The target of that swatting incident was a local official, she said, pacing slowly now, who had publicly criticized Mr. Sorter's coverage of a police brutality protest just a week prior. Coincidence? Perhaps. But the document also includes an internal memo from the local precinct warning that the hoax call nearly resulted in an armed response. Had the target not been out of town that night, this committee might be reviewing a manslaughter report. Now the room wasn't just tense. It was shocked. Sorter looked to the chairwoman, then to his legal counsel seated behind him, then back to Jasmine. She stood across from him like a mirror. Quiet, steady, absolute. She wasn't yelling. She didn't have to. The truth did the shouting for her. Why hasn't this come to light before? A congressman asked, breaking the silence. Jasmine turned slightly toward him. Because the police never confirmed a direct criminal link. Because no charges were filed. And because Mr. Sorter has powerful friends who specialize in burying stories before they bloom, she said. But that doesn't mean it isn't real. It means the system has been doing what it always does, protecting the people who know how to exploit it. The words hung there like smoke over a battlefield. This wasn't just a counterattack. It was a dismantling. Brick by brick, the persona Nick Sorter had built. The righteous truth-teller, the self-made journalist, the outsider punching up, was unraveling in real time. Jasmine stepped back toward her chair, but she didn't sit. Her voice dropped again, quieter now. We came here to talk about how media shapes public trust, and I think the question before this committee is no longer whether that influence exists, she said, turning her gaze once more to the panel, then directly to Sorter. But what happens when that influence falls into the hands of someone who thinks journalism is just another weapon? He didn't speak. He couldn't. And Jasmine Crockett, still standing, still steady, had just rewritten the hearing. The chamber had fallen still, But the silence didn't last. It never does when power feels cornered. Nick Sorter's chair screeched against the floor as he shoved it backward, rising suddenly with a force that startled even the stenographer seated feet away. His hand came down hard against the table, flat, open palm, a dull echo reverberating through the chamber like a gavel dropped out of rhythm. "This is a setup," he barked, voice cracking under the strain. "I'm being ambushed in front of the cameras, in front of the public, with documents that were never disclosed, never verified, never—" He stopped himself, eyes darting to the blinking red lights of the media crews still filming. Sweat beaded at his temple. "This entire hearing is political theater," he growled, "and that file, whatever it is a damn smear job." No one moved to stop him. No one needed to. The outburst did its own damage. In rooms like this, control is currency, and Sortor had just thrown his on the floor. The chairwoman's gavel came down once. "Mr. Sortor, regain your composure. This is a congressional proceeding, not a press conference." But the damage was already rippling outward. A junior congressman who'd earlier nodded along to Sorter's talking points now leaned into his mic with a pointed question. "Mr. Sorter, were you ever formally affiliated with the media firm mentioned in the report?" Sorter didn't answer. "Did you profit directly or indirectly from its coverage of that city council member?" Silence. Another voice followed, sharper. "Were you aware of the burner phone account tied to that address?" The questions weren't accusations. They were surgical strikes, each one peeling back a layer. Across the room, reporters began shifting in their seats. One stood, speaking quietly into a headset as she moved toward the rear exit. Another typed furiously, eyes never leaving her screen. Within moments, two others slipped out, press passes swinging, phones already pressed to ears. The hunt for confirmation had begun. Sorter looked around and saw it. The fracture, the erosion, not of argument, but of belief. The men and women who'd championed him just hours earlier, the ones who had praised him as a truth-teller, a thorn in the establishment's side, were suddenly quiet. No defenses, no interruptions, just distance. His voice tried to rise again, but this time it faltered. "None of this proves anything," he said, softer, yet no less frantic. "It's circumstantial. It's manufactured. She's doing this to distract you." He pointed toward Jasmine, his hand trembling slightly. "She's weaponizing innuendo because she can't stand being challenged, because I told the truth about her." But his words landed differently now, fragile, scattered. What once sounded like defiance now rang of desperation. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was certainty, and it hurt more than 1,000 rebuttals. Another committee member, this time from the majority party, leaned forward. "Mr. Sortor," she said, "do you deny having any knowledge of the swatting incident?" The room stilled again. Sortor's jaw clenched. "I've never," he began, then stopped. "I wasn't involved." But the phrasing was off. The pause too long. The room noticed. At the rear of the chamber, a television monitor flickered. News banners had already begun scrolling across major networks. Breaking: journalistic ethics hearing erupts as allegations surface against conservative commentator. Sorter saw it too. For a moment, his entire face shifted. Not just frustration, but fear. Not of jail, not of guilt, but of something worse in his world, irrelevance. And those who had once aligned themselves with him? They began to lean away. The air was thinner now. It didn't feel like the same room. Just moments earlier, Nick Sorter had been the loudest voice in it, his fist pounding the table, his voice charging the space like a live wire. Now he sat in a defensive slouch, breathing shallow, surrounded by the weight of unanswered questions and retreating allies. He glanced again toward the door, where the reporters had slipped out, as if still hoping someone, anyone, might return with a narrative that could save him. But nothing came. The microphones stayed live. The cameras stayed on. The silence around him swelled like a tide. And across from him, Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She stood with her hands calmly resting on the edge of the table, her body poised but relaxed, utterly still, utterly present. Her eyes were fixed on him, Not wide, not angry. Just fixed. Focused. Her stillness wasn't empty. It was full. Full of all the things she didn't need to say. And that silence did something his accusations couldn't. It broke the tempo. Sorter fidgeted, eyes shifting left, then right, avoiding her gaze, then circling back like a moth drawn to the flame he knew would burn him. She didn't blink. Her silence wasn't passive, it was surgical. It exposed what his shouting had concealed, that he had no more moves, that the rage was a shield, that underneath the talking points and indignation lived a man who was simply afraid of being seen. The committee noticed, everyone noticed. The woman who had been accused of manipulation, extremism, and dishonesty was silent, and her silence said more than his entire defense ever could. Then, as if on cue, the lights in the back corner of the room dimmed slightly. A second monitor lit up. No sound, no narration, just an image. One photo, grainy, cropped at the edges, time-stamped in the corner. It showed Nick Sorter sitting at a private table in a dimly lit wine bar in Georgetown, flanked by 3 men in Navy suits. 2 of them were instantly recognizable to anyone who followed media politics. High-ranking executives from a PAC-funded digital outlet linked to multiple disinformation campaigns. The third was a well-known hedge fund billionaire, publicly apolitical, but quietly suspected to be the bank behind several ultra-conservative media startups. In the photo, Sorter was leaning forward, smiling, not the aggressive smirk from earlier, but something else. Cooperative, pleased, and in front of him sat a closed manila folder, a pen, 2 empty glasses, no captions, no quotes, just the image. Sorter's body jerked slightly in his chair, like someone had thrown cold water in his face. He stared at the screen, unmoving, his eyes scanning the corners of the frame, trying to calculate what it meant, what they knew. Jasmine still hadn't spoken. The chairwoman cleared her throat. "This photograph," she said evenly, "was obtained through a subpoenaed text exchange with a known political media consultant, dated 4 weeks before Mr. Sorter began publishing a coordinated series of op-eds targeting Congresswoman Crockett's tax reform initiative." Her voice remained procedural, but the weight beneath it was unmistakable. The photo was shared with the caption, "Green light confirmed. Distribution phase begins Monday." Sorter inhaled sharply, too sharply, and for a moment it looked like he might speak, but he didn't. His lips parted, then closed again. There was nothing he could say that wouldn't dig deeper. The still image stayed on screen. The timestamp glared like a wound. And still, Jasmine remained motionless. She could have spoken. She could have finished him. She had the right, the stage, and the proof. But she knew better. Words weren't needed now. Power didn't scream. Power waited. The silence grew dense again. Not empty. Full of things nobody wanted to name. Everyone in the room had witnessed the transformation. Moments ago, Sorter had been a media provocateur, a bold voice of dissent, a figure who weaponized controversy and reveled in confrontation. Now he looked like a man who'd walked into a room he thought he controlled, only to find it belonged to someone else. And Jasmine? She looked like the reason why. Behind her, silence was the memory of every time she'd been silenced. Every room she'd walked into where her tone was policed, her expertise second-guessed, her identity politicized. Every time she'd had to work twice as hard to say something half as loud. Now she said nothing, and it shook the foundation. A younger staffer in the corner let out a barely audible exhale, like someone realizing for the first time that the ground had shifted under their feet. Jasmine finally looked away from Sorter, but not in retreat. She turned her attention to the committee, then to the monitors, then back to the people watching behind the cameras. Her silence was no longer about restraint. It was clarity. The chairwoman folded her hands. "Mr. Sorter, do you wish to respond to the image before the committee proceeds?" she asked, her voice taut with formality. Sorter didn't answer. His throat worked, but no sound came. The chairwoman waited 2 seconds, then moved on. "Let the record show the witness declined to comment." Another click of the gavel, another shift in the room, and Jasmine Crockett, unmoving, unspeaking, had just said everything. The chairwoman folded her notes with care, then looked up slowly. "Mr. Sorter," she said, her voice formal, but not without weight. You have the right to make a closing statement before this committee." Her words cut through the silence like a knife through fog. No one else moved. Cameras stayed fixed, phones hovered, ready. And for one suspended moment, all eyes turned to him. Nick Sorter sat still. His shoulders rose and fell in a slow breath. On his face was something approaching calculation, some final effort to reshape the wreckage. He knew he had two doors in front of him. One marked retreat, the other escalation. One would cost him influence, the other everything. And then, without standing, he chose. "I refuse," he said, voice low but sharp, "to play the part you've all written for me." The room stiffened. "I came here expecting bias," he continued, rising now, his hands no longer trembling but clenched at his sides. "But what I walked into was something much darker. This isn't about facts. It's about narrative control. It's about power brokers using elected office to threaten independent voices." He gestured broadly to the committee, to the staffers, to the cameras behind them. "You think this is justice? This is a purge. You dress it up in procedure, but it's the same old Washington. Suppress dissent, protect the insiders, silence anyone who won't play along." He turned, full-bodied now, and locked his gaze on Jasmine. "And as for you," he spat, "you've weaponized your identity, your platform, your silence. You call it truth, but it's performance. You talk about inequality while dining with lobbyists. You stand there and let them destroy me, because you know you can't win in the open." The words hit the air with venom, but they didn't land. They wavered, heavy with accusation but light on credibility. Still, he pressed on. "You accuse me of being compromised?" he barked. "How many campaign donations came in after your last televised clash? How many PACs sent checks when you played the victim on prime time?" He was spiraling now, grasping for volume in the absence of evidence. This is why people don't trust Congress. This is why America's sick of the charade. Because you don't answer to the truth. You answer to polls. The chairwoman raised her hand. "Mr. Sortor, this is a closing statement, not a campaign rally." "Don't pretend this was fair," he snapped, face reddening. "From the moment I walked in here, you had already decided who the villain was." Then he turned back toward the table, exhaled, and finally sat. He believed he had just seized the room back. He believed he had reframed the moment as martyrdom. But belief is a fragile thing. Because just as the chairwoman was about to close the session, another voice cut through the chamber. "Madam Chair," said Representative Delgado from the third row, a moderate with a reputation for staying silent in spectacles like this. "With your permission, I'd like to enter one last item into the record." Sortor froze. The chairwoman hesitated, then nodded. "Proceed." Delgado pulled out a slim flash drive and handed it to the staffer. Within seconds, a soft chime echoed as the monitors flickered to life once more. No video this time, just audio. A scratch of static, then a voice. Sortor's, clear, calm, caught. "Look, if we want to make this Crockett bill radioactive, we can't just argue policy," his voice said. "We need public sentiment, fear. I can have a piece out by Monday, strong language. Push the narrative that she's working with radicals. Tie it to protests, tax hikes, whatever sticks." Silence. Then a second voice responded, unidentified. "We'll fund it. Standard amount." Sorter again. "Half up front. I'll make it ugly." The audio clicked off. No commentary, no questions. Just oxygen leaving the room. Sorter looked like stone, cracked and hollow. The words had played in his own voice. The delivery was unmistakable. And this time, there was no ambiguity, no context to argue, no cut to blame. He was not the victim of a narrative. He was the architect. The committee didn't speak. They didn't have to. The weight of the audio filled every corner of the chamber with one cold, final truth. Nick Sorter had taken money to distort the truth and target a member of Congress. And now it was public record. Cameras zoomed in. The press gallery erupted into furious typing. The silence was no longer contemplative. It was seismic. Jasmine Crockett still hadn't said a word, but across the room her composure remained intact, unshaken, because now the burden to prove had shifted. Now the spotlight was on the man who built his career by casting it on others. And this time, there would be no more spin. The breath in the chamber had already thinned to a whisper when the last syllable of the recording died, and into that stunned quiet the chairwoman spoke with a measured calm that felt almost merciful. She reminded everyone on the committee that congressional decorum forbade any further outbursts, then stated, without flourish, that the evidence introduced placed the integrity of Mr. Sorter's testimony in irreversible doubt. Her gavel struck once, a clean, resonant note that sounded less like punishment and more like confirmation that an unseen line had been crossed. Two uniformed sergeants-at-arms moved from the side aisle in precise, unhurried steps, each nodding in deference to the dais before approaching the witness table. One leaned down and spoke softly to Sortor, who answered with a frantic whisper no microphone could catch, his eyes roving for allies that no longer existed. The chairwoman waited exactly 5 beats, enough for every camera to capture the moment he realized the fight was no longer his to direct. Then she repeated for the record that Mr. Nicholas Sorter was excused from further participation and instructed to leave the chamber immediately. The words "pending federal inquiry" slid into the public transcript like an ice blade into velvet. Sorter's indignation flickered into panic, then into a hollow nod. He rose, shoulders collapsing inward, and followed the officers with the trance-like obedience of someone who finally understands that no volume of protest can unring a bell already struck. The sight of his retreat traveled through the room like an exhale no one dared take until now. Jasmine Crockett did not track him with her eyes, did not shift her weight, nor did she release the quiet strength she had been holding like a drawn bowstring. The committee members' murmurs fluttered around her, statutory citations, requests for recess, whispered disbelief. But she treated each rustle as distant weather, nothing more. Seconds stretched into a hush so dense it felt padded, the kind of stillness that follows a lightning strike when everyone waits to hear if the tree will fall. Yet she spoke no victory words, offered no "I told you so" smile, because this had never been about spectacle for her. The injustice she fought did not end with one man's implosion, and she would not dilute that truth by savoring it. Instead, she pressed her fingertips to the cool lacquer of the table, grounding herself in the smallest fact of the moment. She was still standing, and the record now bore more truth than it had when she walked in. Behind her, the monitors dimmed to black, leaving nothing but the committee seal glowing in silent judgment. In that glow, she breathed once, slow and deep, as if inhaling back every fragment of narrative that had been twisted against her. When the chairwoman formally announced that a bipartisan subcommittee would coordinate with the Justice Department to open a full federal investigation into Mr. Sorter's financial entanglements and potential witness intimidation, Jasmine simply inclined her head. The gavel came down again, once, twice, pronouncing the hearing adjourned. No applause followed, only the low rustle of stunned lawmakers recalibrating their understanding of which stories carry weight and which crumble under evidence. Cameras flashed in rapid staccato, desperate to frame the aftermath for an audience already glued to news tickers. But Jasmine moved with the deliberateness of someone refusing to be reduced to headline fodder. She withdrew a single legal pad from the stack of folders in front of her, closed it with reverent care, and slid it into her briefcase. Its pages held scribbles of strategy, quotes from economists, and margin notes about families whose tax bills dwarfed their paychecks. Those were the voices she carried out of every room, the proof that her fight was larger than any scandal. A pen rolled toward her as the table vibrated under shifting bodies, and she stopped it with a fingertip, another tiny act of control reclaimed. She snapped the briefcase latch, the metallic click crisp against the soft buzz of committee aides gathering discarded note cards. Her coat, draped across the chair back, swung over her arm with a fluid motion practiced by someone who has learned never to let clothing become armor. She paused only long enough to glance at a young staffer who had watched the entire hearing with wide, startled eyes. Their quick, silent nod carried gratitude and understanding in equal measure. Then she stepped from behind the witness table, heels tapping in a rhythm that felt less like departure and more like punctuation. The aisle seemed longer on the way out, lined with faces rearranging themselves into new expressions of respect or relief or unresolved curiosity. Reporters who earlier jostled for sound bites now parted in a subtle choreography, holding out microphones they knew she would not take, whispering her name in tones that mingled hope with caution. She kept her gaze forward, not in avoidance but in discipline. The story she needed to tell next would not be squeezed into a hallway quote. Flashbulbs painted strobe white rectangles across her vision, each burst a reminder that silence can roar louder than any statement read into record. A few feet from the exit, the chairwoman called after her, voice warm with a respect that hadn't existed hours earlier, promising to forward certified copies of all new evidence. Jasmine thanked her without turning, trusting the words to find their mark, because the work between them had only just begun. At the threshold, she paused, letting the weight of the room's shifting gravity settle behind her, feeling the shift echo in her bones. For one instant, she thought of the mothers who had emailed her at 3 in the morning about grocery bills, of the retirees who sent handwritten notes because they couldn't afford stamps twice a month, people for whom tax policy was not theory but survival. She inhaled, tasted the recycled air, and stepped into the corridor beyond. In that corridor, sound returned in waves. Distant printers, polished shoes scuffing marble, the muted drone of cable news anchors broadcasting her silence like a manifesto. She kept moving, paced and steady, the briefcase swinging lightly as if unburdened by the weight it carried. A junior correspondent called after her, voice quavering with desperation, but she offered only a slight respectful smile and continued. Some battles are won in words. Others are won when words are no longer necessary. Beyond a set of tall windows, a gray winter sky hovered, clouds roiling like ink in water, yet somewhere behind them was sun. She knew that from experience. She reached the elevator bank, pressed the call button, and allowed herself one small exhale. A release, not of tension, but of anticipation for the fight still ahead. When the doors slid open, she entered alone, the space echoing with the soft hum of machinery and the steady beat of her own heart, which reminded her that victory rarely looks like celebration. It often looks like a woman leaving a room after truth has done its work. And back in that chamber, chairs scraped and papers shuffled as staffers prepared summaries for tomorrow's headlines. But nothing would erase the hush that had settled the instant evidence eclipsed rhetoric. Senators who once angled for sorters' approval now conferred in tense clusters, the political calculus of loyalty rewritten in real time. Lobbyists checked their phones with grim faces, already plotting new strategies to distance clients from the fallout. The chairwoman dictated formal language for a referral to the Justice Department, her voice precise, unemotional, yet edged with something close to resolve. One aide gingerly powered down the monitors, careful not to disturb the lingering image of that Georgetown dinner, as if the screen itself had become sacred evidence. In the corner, a lone janitor waited to return chairs to their original alignment, sensing instinctively that whatever had happened today, these seats would never quite sit the same. The door through which Jasmine had exited clicked shut, leaving behind an emptiness more eloquent than applause. And in the stillness that followed, the chamber seemed to recognize its own echo, the sound of a narrative rewritten not by volume, but by the quiet certainty of a woman who understood when to speak and when silence could thunder loud enough for the nation to hear. Outside, as Jasmine crossed the marble portico, a breeze lifted the hem of her coat and carried with it the muffled hum of traffic, distant sirens, and a city already stitching this moment into memory. The Capitol dome loomed above, both beacon and burden, its white stone glinting in the muted daylight like a promise that democracy, for all its fractures, could still bend toward accountability. She adjusted her collar, felt the coarse fabric beneath her fingertips, and let her shoulders square beneath a weight that was familiar but newly buoyed by vindication. Somewhere behind her, the buzz of cameras resumed, the chase for headlines as tireless as ever, yet somehow quieter in her mind. She descended the steps, each footfall a steady drumbeat that matched her pulse, measured, calm, prepared for the next hemisphere of the struggle. At the sidewalk, a black sedan waited, its driver watching respectfully in the mirror, engine idling in a gentle purr. Before reaching for the door handle, Jasmine paused, letting one last moment settle in her chest, a still point in a spinning world, a breath of clarity earned through restraint. Then she slid into the back seat, placed the briefcase on her lap as though it were fragile glass, and nodded once to the driver. Behind her, the grand doors of the Capitol closed with a low, resonant echo, sealing in a silence that would reverberate across headlines, living rooms, and legislative offices for weeks to come. And as the sedan rolled forward into the gray afternoon, the woman inside carried with her a victory that needed no cheer, no banner, no sound, only the quiet certainty that truth, once unbound, can find its own voice and speak for generations. The moment the gavel fell for the last time, a clip no longer than 41 seconds leapt from obscure C-SPAN archive to the illuminated pulse of 100 million devices, and by dawn's first glow in Maine, it had already swept westward through high school group chats in Des Moines, break-room televisions in Denver, and late-night talk show punchlines in Los Angeles, converting the once routine spectacle of a congressional hearing into something mythic, an unguarded tableau of a poised black congresswoman letting documented fact dismantle a pundit's empire built on distortion. And every share, every frozen frame, every hastily captioned meme amplified the feeling that the country had just witnessed not a footnote of procedure, but a seismic calibration of moral gravity, a proof that in an era allergic to nuance, raw, unstaged managed truth could still bend the arc of power. Cable producers scrambled to reframe narratives they had first approached as partisan theater. Yet no matter how many think tank guests they booked, or how urgently on-screen chyruns flashed breaking, the momentum stayed outside their control, living instead in subway tunnels where commuters replayed the hearing on cracked phone screens, in community colleges where adjunct professors paused economics lectures so students could plot the lineage between tax loophole activism and media manipulation, and in a million text threads where cousins and coworkers who rarely talked politics circulated the clip with the breathless caption, "Watch the silence at 2:07. This is what strength looks like." When legacy outlets belatedly launched deep dive retrospectives on the Georgetown photograph that tied Nick Sorter to dark money patrons, they discovered the younger audiences they sought had already moved ahead, establishing Discord servers called Receipt Rangers to crowdsource FOIA requests, spinning up open-source browser extensions that watermark videos with chain-of-custody metadata, and organizing Zoom panels where teenage coders explained forensic audio analysis to retirees who had once assumed that a news anchor's tie color signaled credibility, all of which shifted the cultural question from, "Can we trust the press?" to, "Why did we trust them without proof?" Within the first week, an independent data collective charted a 700% spike in small-dollar donations to civic media watchdogs. By the second, elected officials in 6 states pre-filed bills mirroring what commentators dubbed the Crockett Clause, legislation requiring any outlet receiving government press credentials to disclose major shareholders and political advertisers in a machine-readable database, while lobbyists who once skated through oversight found themselves grilled on camera by first-term representatives who pulled no punches and cited the hearing as precedent for demanding transparency at the speed of the internet, a phrase that migrated onto protest banners and late-night monologues alike. Mainstream anchors eager to regain relevance invited Jasmine Crockett for exclusive interviews, but she declined the highest-rated slots, reasoning that the airtime should feature policy experts who could untangle the labyrinth of tax codes for families drowning in April paperwork. Instead, she traveled district by district, sometimes unannounced, touring union halls at dawn, sitting on milk crates outside corner stores, and answering questions that never appeared on televised roundtables. Questions about eviction notices, prescription copays, and why paycheck withholding felt heavier than ever. Even as the press trailed her caravan like weather chasers, desperate for a quote that might bottle the storm of trust she carried. Despite that restraint, her legend outpaced her schedule. Muralists in Oakland painted her profile beside the words, "Silence is a weapon too." Buskers in Chicago riffed jazz solos nicknamed Crockett Crescendo that began with a single sustained note and built into triumphant chords, and a retired librarian in Tallahassee mailed her personal first edition of The Narrative of Frederick Douglass with a handwritten letter praising the power of deliberate quiet, a phrase journalists seized upon to define the episode's rhetorical uniqueness. Because Jasmine, unlike many heroes minted by virality, had won by what she withheld as much as by what she delivered. Meanwhile, Sorter's empire fractured under the glare of documented payoffs. Affiliate stations scrubbed his syndicated segments from archives, advertisers distanced their brands with templated press releases about values alignment, and former colleagues, once eager to ride his algorithmic surf, penned scathing Medium essays claiming they had always suspected unethical sourcing, though leaked Slack logs later revealed they had celebrated the click-through spikes his manufactured outrages produced. A hypocrisy that students dissected in media ethics seminars as proof that institutional correction often follows public disgrace rather than moral epiphany. In Columbus, San Antonio, and Seattle, pop-up newsrooms sprang from repurposed shipping containers in church basements, staffed by displaced indie reporters who crowdfunded expenses with $5 monthly pledges from viewers insisting on receipts or nothing. Those micro-news hubs published exposés that mainstream editors had once tabled for fear of litigation. And when one of them uncovered forged water testing data near a Midwestern chemical plant, the health committee chair cited the post-Sorter era of citizen vigilance while announcing emergency hearings, a declaration that landed on the front page of the Washington Post next to a photo of college freshmen raising homemade boom mics at a city council meeting. For Jasmine, the din crested 3 weeks later when she agreed to a single long-form interview on Public Square, a PBS Sunday program known for giving guests unbroken blocks of time. Under studio lights softened to an amber glow, she spoke at length about wealth extraction, algorithmic despair, and the moral duty of officials to refuse defamation, even when fighting back is less glamorous than trending, her cadence steady but unsentimental. And when the host, in the final minute, asked whether she regretted detonating a scandal that felled a man's career and cost dozens their jobs, she paused, letting the steady hum of the studio become audible to both of them, then smiled, wide but not unkind, and answered, "No, because truth doesn't need a bodyguard. It only needs someone willing to open the door." That single sentence ricocheted across social networks like a psalm for the chronically misinformed. Lecturers in rhetoric parsed its cadence. Theologians praised its moral clarity. Entrepreneurs printed it on tote bags whose proceeds funded local investigative desks, and a late-night comic called it the shortest closing argument in congressional history. But the phrase's real power resided offline, whispered between exhausted public school teachers, photocopying lesson plans, repeated by warehouse workers timing break room scrolls, and taped to the dashboards of rideshare drivers, who, for once, felt a politician had spoken to them without translation. In the weeks that followed, pundits debated whether the Crockett wave would endure beyond a single news cycle, but the evidence of permanence unfolded quietly. A journalism graduate program added a course titled Silence as Strategy. Union organizers clipped the 41-second hearing video into orientation sessions on corporate disinformation, and when an oil-funded think tank attempted to smear a Navajo water rights activist using a deceptively edited clip, local high schoolers dismantled the video's metadata on TikTok within hours, forcing a network retraction and proving that the public had evolved past uncritical consumption. This response, cascading across regional newscasts, prompted a columnist at The Atlantic to declare, "The nation's bullshit meter is finally self-calibrating." And somewhere amid the interviews she declined, the bills she drafted, and the countless constituent letters she answered by hand at 2 a.m., Jasmine Crockett found herself standing in the muted dawn light outside her Capitol office, watching crews remove outdated satellite dishes from a media annex scheduled for renovation into a public demonstration studio, realizing that the edifice she had toppled was not just Nick Sorter's career, but an architecture of intimidation so old it had weathered generations, yet fragile enough to crumble when confronted by a silence wielded with surgical honesty. An honesty that, like the rising sun, required no applause and cast its glow on anyone brave enough to look without blinking. The roar of headlines faded into a charged hush, and in that hush, a single insight unfurled. When deception finally stalls, it is not volume that wrecks it, but the unblinking stillness of a conscience unwilling to barter accuracy for applause. Jasmine Crockett's poised silence, captured in a freeze frame that rocketed through every feed, recalibrated moral gravity across the nation, proving that unscripted truth still bends power in an era drenched in performative outrage. Viewers recognize that discipline can slice deeper than diatribe, that calm, held long enough, transforms into a blade keener than any rhetorical flourish. In that moment, she rewrote the physics of influence. Noise cannibalizes itself in the presence of immovable fact, while patience resonates outward like a tuning fork, aligning hearts battered out of rhythm by sensationalism. The lesson felt electric because it cut across partisan reflex. It reminded audiences that democracy begins not with winning a shout match, but with guarding the factual bedrock beneath the din. Her victory demanded a recalibration of assumptions. Perhaps the most radical act now is restraint. Perhaps the most disarming weapon is refusing the choreography of conflict. That idea raced through group chats and lecture halls, giving new shape to the very whispers that had once tried to shrink her presence. She showed that the tool historically used to brand outspoken women, silence, could be seized as a counter-weapon, melted down, and reforged into armor. There, in a single chamber, centuries of buried voices found a modern echo, and it thundered louder than any gavel strike. Yet beneath that thunder lay a deeper lesson about inequity, about how injustice rarely announces itself with flashing sirens, but slips through boardroom doors in whispered deals and carefully edited tapes. Reputations are not merely damaged by rumor. They are sculpted in advance by gatekeepers who gamble on a public too weary or too cynical to question who funds the microphone, who owns the platform, who edits the reel. Jasmine's ordeal exposed that machinery. She peeled back the siding and revealed the gears, forcing Americans to confront a sobering fact. Much of what masquerades as balance is a tightrope strung by those who profit from imbalance. Her detailed evidence redefined complicity, showing that every unchecked narrative is a currency transacted between power and complacency. The injustice she faced was not a single smear, but a networked ecosystem set to devour the credibility of dissenting voices while laundering disinformation as legitimate concern. In letting documentation speak louder than indignation, she flipped the cost ledger. Peddlers of distortion now paid in lost influence, while seekers of truth gained the priceless commodity of public trust. That shift recentered the conversation on root causes: loopholes that starve schools and fill offshore accounts, paywalls that monetize confusion, algorithms calibrated to fatigue civic curiosity. By dragging the unseen economies of influence into daylight, she forced every viewer to ask whether they had unknowingly invested their attention in a market of lies. Suddenly, verifying sources felt less like homework and more like self-defense, a recalibration of civic reflex that would ripple long after trending hashtags dimmed. Injustice, once an abstraction, wore a face, a voice, a spreadsheet, and a timestamp. And once seen, it refused to be unseen. From that exposure grew a lesson about courage, not the cinematic kind that charges barricades, but the quieter variety that stands unflinching while an architecture of intimidation exhausts itself. Courage was a woman refusing to speak when provoked, trusting that silence could hold the weight of centuries of dismissal without cracking. Courage was knowing the cameras sought an outburst, to edit, to meme, to monetize, and giving them nothing but disciplined stillness instead. It was the choice to weaponize composure as a rebuttal to every coded dismissal, too loud, too emotional, too ambitious, that had ever trailed her career like barbed wire. In 30 televised seconds, she mapped the emotional topography of restraint: shoulders squared, breath measured, gaze unwavering, a tableau of poise that turned decades of bias on its head. The gambit worked because it subverted a pattern older than the room itself. It forced adversaries to fill the silence, revealing their own hollowness. She proved that the line between dignity and defiance can blur into a single stance so grounded that chaos ricochets off it like hail off marble. That stance became a lighthouse for viewers who, for the first time, saw poise reframed as protest, patience reinterpreted as power. Courage, the nation learned, is sometimes choosing not to match force for force, but to let falsehoods collapse under their own weight. And the echo of that choice traveled into classrooms, council chambers, and kitchen table debates, teaching that bravery can be measured in controlled breaths as surely as in battle cries. Intertwined with courage came a lesson in responsibility, illuminating the civic mandate to rebuild information filters hacked by algorithmic despair. When Jasmine lifted receipts instead of raising her voice, she invited citizens to treat every headline with the skepticism they reserve for street corner gossip, to demand metadata as fiercely as they once demanded catchy slogans. Grassroots networks sprang to life, compiling open-source toolkits for verifying video provenance, drafting templates for FOIA requests, and running pop-up workshops where teenagers taught grandparents how to read domain registries. Each small act of collective verification became a load-bearing beam in an emerging architecture of vigilance, a structure stronger than any single watchdog group precisely because it was decentralized. The message was clear. Democracy disintegrates not when liars lie, but when listeners cease to question. And the antidote to propaganda is not cynicism, but painstaking curiosity. Her silence hadn't just unmasked one manipulator, it deputized millions to audit their own attention. Suddenly, fact-checking was not a niche hobby, but a civic ritual, and libraries, once starved for relevance, found themselves hosting standing-room-only media literacy nights. That shift went beyond punishing a fallen pundit. It rewired the reflexes of a public too long numb by the constant hum of misinformation. In this new rhythm, every scroll became an opportunity to pause, evaluate, and decide. An invitation to guard the gates of perception rather than leaving them on autopilot. Responsibility, once outsourced to journalists and juries, returned home to living rooms and bus stops, and it carried the unmistakable imprint of Jasmine's disciplined quiet. Her victory delivered yet another lesson about institutional redemption. The idea that creaking systems, though sluggish and scarred, can pivot when incontrovertible proof meets unblinking moral vision. For years, committees had tolerated distortions as political sport, but in a single afternoon, they referred a media titan for federal investigation, acknowledging that propaganda disguised as news posed a national risk. That pivot demonstrated that broken mechanisms can grind forward if pushed by irrefutable documentation and public scrutiny in equal measure, and that when officials resist change, they do so at the peril of legitimacy. Teehee Capital, once echoing with complacency, reverberated with bipartisan talk of press ethics reform, a sign that truth, when made unavoidable, can still prod legislation out of gridlock. Jasmine's silence forced lawmakers to confront their complicity. How often had they let lies slide when those lies served their short-term agendas? The investigation into dark money media ties expanded, implicating lobbyists who assumed they operated beyond daylight, and the ripple touched every corner of the political industry, from pollsters to pundits. Institutionally, the hearing proved that oversight remains possible when facts are supported by public demand and anchored by moral clarity. It reminded cynics that transparency is not a relic of some bygone golden age, but a tool always available, provided someone is brave enough and persistent enough to wield it. Institutions, like the people they serve, can relearn accountability if confronted by evidence sturdy enough to hold their gaze. All of these strands braided together into a final, human lesson, articulated when Jasmine finally broke her deliberate quiet on public square. Asked if she regretted toppling a media empire and setting off layoffs and investigations, she paused, letting the host and the nation lean into the hush. A smile spread across her face, not triumphant, but certain, as if she were unveiling a truth so simple and ancient it hardly needed words. "No," she said, voice calm yet carrying the weight of generations. "Because truth doesn't need protection. It only needs someone willing to open the door." In that line, she condensed every frame of the hearing, every document, every heartbeat of restraint, into a guiding principle. Truth, she implied, is like light in a shuttered attic, permanent, patient, and ready the instant a window lifts. Her words became a blueprint for an age struggling under the noise of unchecked narrative. Proof that defending reality does not require armor, only the deliberate courage to unveil what already exists. In living rooms across the country, parents quoted her to children. In classrooms, educators printed the sentence on bulletin boards. Protest placards carried it through city streets, and aspiring journalists taped it above their laptops as a vow. Because the truest lesson ringing from the marble chamber, through fiber optic cables and into human hearts, was that you cannot kill a truth once it dares to speak, and you cannot silence a people once they recognize that their quietest convictions can thunder louder than any manufactured lie. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.